Have you ever stopped to think about how much it costs to live hidden behind a mask? The world applauds your persona, but when you look in the mirror, you know it's not real. And here's the kicker: it's not your truth that prevents you from thriving. It's precisely the fact that you hide it. Carl Jung said that what you reject in yourself becomes your shadow, and this shadow consumes your energy, your creativity, your motivation. The ironic thing is that society has taught us to believe that being accepted is worth more than being authentic. But look around. Those who truly thrive aren't those who please everyone, but rather those who dare to be whole, even at the risk of upsetting others. Spirituality confirms this. Hiding is a silent betrayal of one's own soul. The ego pretends to be protection, but in practice it's a prison. And here's the secret no one told you. The world doesn't pay for the character you play. It pays for the energy of who you truly are. The moment you stop asking permission, face shadow work, integrate your archetypes, and decide to truly expose yourself, is the same moment life begins to reward you for it. And the question is, how long will you hide? Most people spend their lives believing they are what they show the world. This is the great illusion of the social mask, confusing the persona with one's own identity. Carl Jung explained that the persona is necessary, of course. It's the psychic garment we wear to interact with society. But the problem begins when someone becomes so attached to this mask that they forget who they really are behind it. It's like living in an endless theater, where every gesture, word, and even silence is calculated to please. Spirituality reminds us that this creates an invisible prison. On the outside, everyone smiles at you. On the inside, you feel the weight of not being truly seen. This illusion becomes even more dangerous because it seems to work. The person wins applause, receives promotions, earns likes and external validation. The ego thrills with each recognition, believing it's in control. But deep down, the soul knows it's not real. This is why so many seemingly successful men and women report an absurd emptiness. They built empires on false ground. Jung would say, this is the price of living only for the persona. The shadow accumulates, the truth is hidden, and the self is abandoned. The consequence? Anxiety, silent crises, and a life that seems brilliant to others but unbearable when the bedroom door closes. A clear example is the professional who wears a suit and speaks with authority at the office, but feels small and lost at home. Or the person who posts perfect photos on social media, but cries in the bathroom when no one sees. The social mask deceives everyone except the one wearing it. Spirituality points to this as a broken soul contract. You came to be you, but betrayed yourself in the name of acceptance. This is where shadow work becomes inevitable, because only by facing your hidden parts can you break the illusion. And here's the most painful detail. Society encourages this illusion. From an early age, we learn that acceptance is more important than being authentic. Children learn to hide their anger to avoid punishment. Adolescents repress their sensitivity to avoid being called weak. Adults don a protective armor of efficiency to avoid appearing vulnerable. And so, archetype after archetype, we construct an image that isn't ours, but rather what the world expects. The problem is that, at some point, this farce crumbles. And when it collapses, the inevitable conflict arises. The clash between the ego that wants to maintain its disguise and the self that cries out for authenticity. This is where true awakening begins. The clash between living to please and living to be. When the social mask begins to crack, one of the greatest conflicts in psychic life arises, the clash between ego and self. Carl Jung explained that the ego is like the manager of our consciousness, practical, rational, concerned with maintaining order and survival. It seeks security, stability, and recognition. The self, on the other hand, is the center of the psyche, the totality that calls for individuation. It is not content with crumbs of acceptance. It demands authenticity. Spirituality translates this clash as the struggle between the voice of the soul and the noise of the world. And the most intriguing thing is that this conflict is not silent. It appears in symptoms, in existential crises, in dissatisfactions that the ego tries to stifle but fails. This shock can be felt in many ways. The person has a good job, but feels like they're dying inside. Or they maintain a seemingly stable relationship, but feel like they're betraying themselves daily. The ego says, "Stay, it's safer," while the self whispers, "Be who you are, even if it costs you dearly." Shadow work comes into play here as an essential practice. It reveals how the ego has created layers of defense, and how the shadow, everything we reject within ourselves, needs to be integrated for the soul to stop screaming. Jung reminded us that to ignore the self is to condemn oneself to psychic illness. In practice, this conflict can even manifest itself in the body. How many people develop psychosomatic illnesses because they are living against their truth? How many carry physical pain with no apparent cause, but which is actually the burden of an incongruent life? Spirituality calls this blocked energy. Analytical psychology explains how internal repressions transform into symptoms. The ego tries to maintain the performance, but the self refuses to live in perpetuity. A practical example. Think of an artist who works as an accountant just to please his family. The ego feels relieved. We have stability, but the self suffocates. You were born to create. This tension creates anxiety, panic attacks, or even a profound emptiness. No salary or praise will be enough, because it's not about money or prestige, but about inner truth. And it is at this moment that the hero archetype begins to emerge, the call to undertake the journey of individuation, even if the price is high. And this price exists, because living hidden behind the ego and persona has a high cost, but daring to be guided by the self also demands courage. This is where the inevitable question arises. What is the real price of continuing to hide? The price of hiding is much higher than most people realize. Living behind a persona feels safe. You're accepted, praised, even promoted. But deep down, the ego knows it's putting on a show, and the self feels betrayed. Carl Jung explained that every time we stifle our truth, the shadow grows, and it always finds a way to manifest itself. Spirituality reinforces this. What you don't express makes you sick, and the bill comes in many forms: anxiety, depression, identity crises, superficial relationships, and even physical illness. Hiding may keep the appearance intact, but it slowly destroys the soul. This price also manifests itself in lost time. How many people spend entire years working on something they don't believe in, just to please others? How many maintain friendships that don't nourish their soul, just so they don't appear different? It's the ego trying to avoid rejection, while the self suffers in silence. Shadow work shows us that every time we hide, we reinforce the unconscious narrative that we're not good enough. This erodes self-esteem, steals vital energy, and creates a half-life. Ultimately, hiding is living as an extra in your own story. There's also the invisible price, the constant feeling of emptiness. Even when everything seems right on the outside, inside there's a persistent unease that something is missing. This happens because life demands alignment with the internal archetypes that cry out for expression. The creator who doesn't create becomes ill. The warrior who doesn't fight loses strength. The wise man who doesn't share his knowledge becomes frustrated. Spirituality would say it's the soul crying out for its own imprisonment. Jung would say it's the psyche imploding under the weight of lies. Practical example. Think of someone who has a natural talent for teaching, but spends years hidden away in an office. At the end of the day, they feel drained, without energy, even without physical exertion. This is the price of denying one's calling. Or consider someone who lives in a relationship of convenience. There are no fights, but there is also no truth. To others, it's a perfect life. Inside, it's a slow death. This is the cost of hiding, a life that never truly blossoms. And there comes a time when the reckoning can no longer be ignored. The body begins to scream, the mind begs for change, and the self demands courage. That's when the turning point happens, when the person decides to stop asking for permission to exist and finally begins to show themselves as they truly are. There comes a moment when the pain of hiding becomes greater than the fear of showing oneself. This is where the turning point occurs. Carl Jung would say it's the self finally taking the helm of the psyche, pushing the ego back into its proper place. Spirituality calls this the awakening of courage. The moment the soul decides it can no longer negotiate its truth. The individual stops asking permission from the world, from family, friends, society, and begins to live for themselves. This transition is liberating, but it also requires determination. It's like crossing a bridge without looking back, because you know that if you turn back, you'll lose the opportunity. At this point, the ego screams, "What if you're rejected? What if you fail? What if they laugh at you?" But the answer no longer comes from fear, but from the inner truth. It would be worse to live a life that isn't mine. The persona tries to regain control, suggesting more subtle masks, but the individual realizes they no longer need disguises to exist. It's a movement of individuation in action, abandoning the role others have written for them and assuming the leading role. This is the turning point in any journey of transformation. In practice, this shift manifests itself in concrete decisions. Someone decides to publish their first original text, even fearing criticism. Another decides to leave a purposeless job to create something aligned with their values. A person decides to speak about their spirituality in public, even knowing they'll be judged. The point is that at this point the fear still exists, but it no longer paralyzes. This is where the warrior archetype emerges within the psyche. It's not about defeating others, but about confronting oneself. This shift also redefines relationships. Those who have always sought approval begin to realize they no longer need to beg for acceptance. Friends drift away, family members feel strange, but new, more authentic connections emerge. It's as if the universe responds to the inner movement by opening unexpected paths. Spirituality asserts that when you show yourself, you attract people and opportunities that vibrate at the same frequency. Jung explained how synchronicities begin to manifest when the self aligns with the external world. And it's at this point that a new reality begins to unfold, when the courage to be who you are stops being merely liberating and starts being rewarded. A powerful question then arises. What happens when, instead of being punished for your truth, you start being rewarded for it? There's an almost magical moment in the journey of those who decide to stop hiding, when life begins to reward authenticity. Carl Jung would point out that when the self aligns, the external world responds in sync. Spirituality calls this abundance, but not as something mystical disconnected from reality, but rather as a natural consequence of living one's own truth. What once seemed impossible now begins to happen. You begin to be recognized and even rewarded, not for the role you played, but for who you truly are. And here's the thing, this reward isn't just financial, but also emotional and spiritual. It's the feeling of finally being seen, without a mask, without a persona, and yet still valued. In practice, this point can be frightening because it challenges everything the ego believed. The ego said, they'll only like you if you fit in. But reality shows the opposite. The more you show your truth, the more doors open. Think of artists, writers, therapists, spiritual leaders, or entrepreneurs who began to shine precisely when they stopped copying and embraced their own style. This is the archetype of the creator in action, bringing to the world something that only you could offer. Shadow work remains essential here because exposing yourself also brings judgment, and only those who have integrated their shadow can handle criticism without crumbling. A concrete example: someone who has always worked hiding their sensitive side decides to share their vision of spirituality on social media. At first, they receive mixed reviews, but over time, they find an entire community thirsting for this truth. Or a professional who, instead of following cold corporate standards, brings authenticity to their services and attracts clients who value precisely this essence. It's the movement of transforming pain into value, shadow into light, authenticity into prosperity. It's important to emphasize that being paid for the truth doesn't mean living effortlessly. There's still work, there's still discipline, there are still setbacks. But the difference is that now there's alignment. Effort doesn't drain, it nourishes. Money doesn't buy approval, but it sustains freedom. Connections aren't based on self-interest, but on resonance. It's abundance that arises when the self takes control and external life reflects this new internal order. And this is where many begin to understand one of Jung's and spirituality's greatest lessons. Individuation is not just a process of psychic healing, but also a practical key to living abundantly. And this brings us to the next step, understanding how individuation can, in fact, be the map to a prosperous and fulfilling life. Carl Jung asserted that individuation is the most important process in human life, becoming who one truly is. And interestingly, this path not only heals internal wounds, but also opens external doors. Spirituality calls this living in abundance, not in the superficial sense of accumulation, but as the natural flow of life when the ego ceases to dominate and the self assumes centrality. When the individual integrates the shadow, recognizes the persona as a tool, not an identity, and aligns their internal archetypes, something extraordinary happens. The world begins to reflect this internal order. What once seemed like scarcity begins to manifest as synchronicities, opportunities, and even material prosperity. In practice, individuation becomes the foundation of everything. A professional who acts in alignment with who they truly are finds not only satisfaction, but also concrete results. People who live their truth attract partners, clients, and friends who vibrate on the same frequency. This isn't just mysticism, it's psychology. When you position yourself with integrity, your communication becomes clearer, your energy more magnetic, and your choices more coherent. Spirituality translates this as the law of attraction. Jung would call it psychic coherence. The effect is the same, abundance on multiple levels. A practical example: someone who has always hidden for fear of rejection begins to expose themselves authentically. This courage, though simple, changes everything. The creator archetype manifests itself in their work, the sage archetype in their speech, the lover archetype in their relationships. This integration creates real value, and real value is always rewarded, whether with recognition, partnerships, or financial return. Shadow work here functions as maintenance. With each criticism or challenge, the individual doesn't lose their way because they already know their shadows and know how to deal with them. Abundance in this context ceases to be a distant goal and becomes a natural consequence. It's the flow that emerges when there's no longer any internal friction between who you are and what you show. The ego may seek to control, but it no longer has the power to sabotage. The persona may appear, but it doesn't dominate. The self ultimately guides. And when this happens, life responds in scale, because nothing is more magnetic than authenticity. And here we come to the most decisive part, Abundance is not a privilege of the few, but a universal calling. What separates those who experience it from those who remain trapped in scarcity is just one thing: courage. Courage to expose yourself, to stop hiding, to embrace individuation not as a theory, but as a daily practice. And it is precisely this calling that closes the cycle, the final summons for you to show yourself to the world. Ultimately, everything converges on one point: courage. Courage to shed the persona, face the ego, embrace the shadow, and let the self finally speak louder. Carl Jung would say that the greatest human tragedy is to live without ever finding oneself. Spirituality is complete. To hide is to deny one's own mission. Therefore, the ultimate call is clear: to expose oneself not as someone begging for acceptance, but as someone offering presence. To show oneself not as a character, but as a whole human being. And yes, it's scary. It gives you butterflies. But it's precisely this fear that reveals you're on the right path. This calling requires more than pretty words. It requires action. It's raising your voice when your ego tells you to keep quiet. It's publishing that text, launching that project, sharing that spiritual vision you fear will seem strange. It's admitting that the shadow work doesn't end, but that you no longer need to be ashamed of your shadow. It's recognizing that the archetypes within you are not at war, but in an orchestra. And that the self, when manifested, creates a music the world needs to hear. This is the final act of individuation, stopping living for approval and starting to live for truth. A simple example: think of someone who always had a unique vision but kept it to themselves for fear of judgment. The day they decide to speak, they discover that hundreds of people were waiting for that exact message. Or someone who decides to trade a secure career for an uncertain path, but one aligned with their essence, and finds not only fulfillment, but also prosperity. This is the miracle of exposure. When you show yourself, you discover that what seemed like weakness was precisely what made you valuable. Courage, in this sense, is not the absence of fear, but the decision to walk, even though trembling. It's putting yourself on stage, not as a character, but as an author. It's accepting that some will criticize, others will reject, but those who remain will be those who recognize your truth. Spirituality asserts that when you show yourself, the universe reorganizes itself in your favor. Jung would say, it's the self-radiating energy capable of transforming the field around you. And here's the final invitation. You can continue living hidden behind your ego and persona, paying the price of never being seen, or you can cross the line and choose courage. The world doesn't need more masks. It needs your authenticity. And perhaps it's waiting for the very moment you decide to stop hiding. In the end, it all comes down to a choice. Continue living as a character, or have the courage to show the world who you truly are. Carl Jung said that individuation is the most difficult journey in life, and also the only one worth taking. Because the ego will always suggest masks, the persona will always want the spotlight, but only the self can deliver the sense of wholeness you so desperately seek. Spirituality reminds us, hiding may earn you applause, but it will never bring you peace. So I ask you, how long will you trade your authenticity for crumbs of acceptance? How long will you hide behind the shadows for fear of rejection? What if, instead of asking for permission, you started getting paid in money, in respect, in true love, precisely for living your truth? This is the turning point, when you understand that vulnerability is not a weakness, but your greatest strength. If this video touched you, tell us in the comments which part resonated most with you. Sometimes sharing your truth is the first step to breaking free from hiding. And of course, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and continue walking with me on this journey of individuation, spirituality, and profound transformation. Because this is just the beginning, and the world needs to see who you really are.